Welcome to this online lesson about opposition to the Vietnam War. The aims today are to know some reasons why people opposed the war in Vietnam, secondly to explain what factors affected this opposition, and thirdly to link reasons for opposition together and see what relationships there are. As a do now task, you can consider the following. The following factors can influence the amount of opposition a war can face. Which do you think is the most relevant in the case of the Vietnam War? How much the war costs? How many enemies are killed? How many soldiers are killed, in this case US soldiers, how long the war lasts, and the reasons the war is being fought in the first place. If you want to give this some time and thought, pause the video now. What thoughts did we come up with? Well, the fact is that all of these factors would have had some bearing on people's opposition to the war, and much of it was related to the age of the people. For example, how many US soldiers were killed would have mattered most to the people who were families of soldiers who were either serving or who unfortunately had paid that price. How much the war cost might have mattered more to high taxpayers and to politicians. So there's no wrong answer, but it gives you an idea that just talking about opposition is not a simple task, and it's not one that relies on any single factor. We must consider all of these in different variations if we're going to understand why people opposed the Vietnam War. Just the one term in Cloak's compendium of annoying old-fashioned words that you need to know today, and that is counterculture. This is the culture of young people in the 1960s that quite simply went against traditional values. Sex, drugs and rock and roll sum this up. You may have heard of, for example, the hippie movement. That would be considered part of the counterculture. Much of the popular music of the time also was part of this counterculture. What must be realised is that the young people of the 1960s often had parents who were young people during World War II. This was a very different time. By the time they were raising families in the 1950s, for example, many traditional values, for example, women staying at home and doing housework while the men went out and provided for their families, had kind of crept back into American society. It was also linked with traditional views on Christianity, for example. So it's quite a complicated term for an idea that's actually quite well known. Some tasks then. Record and explain this key term. Then, as an extension, why might counterculture be related to protest against the Vietnam War? Thirdly, and as a challenge, can you identify any examples of 60s counterculture? If you want to have a go at those tasks, press pause on the video now and then press play when you're ready to continue. Okay, what did you come up with? Did you identify any examples of 60s counterculture? Well, if you didn't, I've included in the description to this video a link to a particular counterculture song which sums up many of the views of the 60s counterculture and the hippie vibe of the era. It's a video taken from the famous Woodstock Music Festival in 1969. It shows Country Joe and the Fish singing their song Fixin' to Die Rag. This is a very obvious and tongue-in-cheek and quite humorous song that criticises the Vietnam War. Much as I can't condone Country Joe's language at certain points in this video, that in itself is quite a good reminder of what the counterculture was all about. It was a rebellion against what were considered traditionally acceptable. So watch that if you'd like to have an example of a counterculture song from the 1960s and going into the early 1970s. We'll move on. We're going to look now at some generalised views as why some people were against the war and some people were for it. To get some clues, first of all, let's have a look at the pictures. On the left, we can see a young man with long hair. You might call him a stereotypical hippie. He's holding a small piece of paper up in the air. It is likely that this is his draft card, which was related to conscription in the army. A common act of rebellion was to either burn, as looks like what's happening here, or tearing up your draft card as a way of opposing the draft. Also look at the signs and their messages. These are typical anti-war sentiments at the time. On the other hand, on the right, we can see a more stereotypical American patriot carrying the flag. He looks more middle class, smartly dressed in a tie, and he is definitely older than the people on the left. He carries a sign that says, "Mr. President, do not go sell us out to Red China or Moscow against liberty." Red in this case refers to communism, which was the ruling political system in those countries at this time, and indeed remains so in China to this day. When we have a look at these anti-war and pro-war views, we are talking about stereotypes here and generalisations. Nevertheless, they should give you a good idea of some of the broad themes as to why people were against the war or for it. They're listed as a series of statements, and we'll have a look at the anti-war ones first. The draft is not fair. All war is wrong. The South Vietnamese government is repressive. No Vietnamese ever called a black person, well, the N-word, which I won't say here, but I'm sure you know it. The point here is that this was at the same time as the civil rights campaigns were showing that black people in America were treated as second-class citizens, and the point was being made that the Vietnamese were not to blame for that. Money should be spent on improving the ghettos, also related to the civil rights movement. And American action is killing children in Vietnam. Now let's have a look at some of the pro-war sentiments. Support our troops. We have to fight communism. It's a real threat. Tell the North Vietnamese to be pacifist. Remember, pacifists are people who are against war. My brother died for his country. We need to keep fighting. We're fighting for the freedom of the South Vietnamese. And I've been there. We have to fight the VC. Presumably that would be said by a soldier returning who wants the job done. A task then. Firstly, summarise the reasons for support and opposition in 2 short paragraphs. Try to include several of these statements or several of these sentiments within each paragraph. Further summarise the reasons in 3 words each. I'll say that again. Part 2. Further summarise the reasons in 3 words each. So choose 3 words to sum up the anti-war sentiment and 3 key words to sum up the pro-war sentiment. Pause the video now, and when you're ready to continue, just press play. I wonder what 3 words you came up with. Well, for anti-war, you might have come up with something like pacifism. You might have come up with civil rights as well. I realise that might be hyphenated rather than truly being one word. You might have come up with injustice. Similarly, for pro-war, you might have come up with anti-communist. Again, 2 words, but if hyphenated, we can count them as one. You might have come up with patriotic. And you might have come up with traditional. This was often a view of older people who had more traditional values rather than the counterculture. But whatever you came up with, hopefully it will make these themes more memorable to you. Moving on. We're going to do a research and revise topic now. Here you're going to have to be a bit more independent. I'm going to give you some of the basic background to each of these different themes within this presentation, but it'll be up to you to go away and use online resources or books to find the rest of the information that you need. So this will be today's main task. You will create either mind maps or revision summaries based upon the following themes. You will create summaries for each of the following topics. Student opposition, this is including SDS, which was Students for a Democratic Society. Opposition to the draft, remember this is conscription into the army. Media coverage of the Vietnam War. And the My Lai Massacre of 1968. A word about My Lai. There's no 2 ways about it. My Lai is simply horrible. Be careful what sources you use for this, especially if you're using online sources. You may well come across some images which are pretty shocking and very unpleasant indeed. So use a real amount of caution when you're looking up My Lai. I will talk you through the basics of My Lai on here so that you can make a more informed choice about where you get your information from. I'll also be including a video which does a really good job of summing up the background to My Lai as one of the links in the description. And I do urge you to watch that as one of your main sources of information about that horrible event. Something you might want to consider in terms of what to include is, as the very basics for each of these topics, you want to have a look at who was involved, why did they hold these anti-war views, and how did they protest, what change did they bring about, when were they most active, and as an extension, this could be related to events in Vietnam or indeed in the USA itself, remembering the links that this has to the civil rights topic. As an extension, you could also explain potential links between topics, links between students and the draft, and a little reminder of one of Country Joe and the Fish's lyrics up there too. This would be a good screen to pause it on if you want to take a screenshot, for example, of the main instructions for today's task before we move on to the basics for each of those 4 main topics. We're going to have a look at student opposition first. Firstly, student opposition. Who? Well, it involved 8.5 million students by 1970, so a very significant protest movement. Why? Many young people rejected their parents' generation's views. Remember this idea of the counterculture that rebelled against these traditional views. How? Well, burning draft cards, strikes and boycotts, and also protest marches. The burning of the draft cards didn't just affect the men who were being conscripted. Remember, their friends and any women in their life were often equally horrified at the idea that their loved ones were going to be drafted. What did they do? Well, student groups like Students for a Democratic Society, who you can have a good look at, got media attention, but they were a minority, and they were mostly white and middle class. This often led to them getting accusations of being privileged, which somewhat blunted some of their effect. When? Well, throughout the war, but particularly in 1970 when Nixon expanded the war into Cambodia, and in 1971 when the war expanded into Laos as well. We're going to be having a look at an example of the student protest movement and a disaster that happened as a result of it at a place called Kent State. That's given you a bit of introduction to your first group. Make some notes on it and then go away and do your own research. When you're ready, revisit this and press play. Okay, we're going to have a look at topic 2 now. The draft. In the picture we can see a draft card. Draft cards were drawn supposedly at random, and they would include the information that you could see on there. And once your draft card was drawn, you basically had very little choice but to join the army. There were ways out of it, but it wasn't easy, as we'll see. So, who opposed the draft? Men aged 18 or over, but few men older than 26. Those were the main people who were drafted into the army, being of an age where they were usually most physically fit and healthy to serve in the armed forces. Why? Well, people saw the lottery system as unfair, as wealthier people were more often exempt or were able to avoid the draft. For example, some wealthy people were able to get doctors to sign medical forms for them saying that they were unfit for service. Indeed, controversially, President Donald Trump was deemed unfit for service by his doctor. Whether or not that's really true, it does show that people who came from a position of wealth and privilege were often more likely to be able to avoid the draft. How? Well, burning draft cards by setting up clinics to give advice on avoiding the draft. So people who had managed to avoid the draft before could give advice to those who perhaps didn't have that information. Also, what were they? Well, 170,000 conscientious objectors avoided the draft. This was legal, but the process of actually doing it was quite humiliating. Similarly, 50,000 people left the USA illegally. For example, they might have crossed the border into Canada and settled there to avoid the draft. Again, this was all often done illegally so that their settled status in those countries could be called into question. But by the time they might get called back, the war was often over or they were too old. When? Well, from 1965 when the draft was introduced. Before this point, the draft was not used to get men to join the army. Moving on to the next task. Media coverage. In the pictures here we see two of the reporters from the CBS News channel. At the top we see a man called Morley. This is part of a famous 1964 report from a village called Cam Ne. We can see a distressed Vietnamese villager in the background. This particular report was one of the earliest to show the effects of search and destroy missions to the American public and caused widespread shock. Underneath we can see Walter Cronkite. This is a screen grab from his address after the Tet Offensive, in which he argued that the war in Vietnam could not be won in the way that the politicians have been saying. Cronkite was one of the most respected and trusted journalists in America and very much a household name. So who? Newspapers and TV news coverage, particularly CBS reporter Morley at the top and CBS News anchor Walter Cronkite down below. Why? Well, the news media went from mostly supporting political decisions, but the on-the-scene reporting called into question the actions of US leaders and soldiers, and that was not covered up. Remember, this is one of the first wars to be reported truly on the television rather than just in newspapers or in the cinemas. Newspapers and cinemas were easier to censor, and for example in World War II, censorship was very much common within these forms of media. It was less easy to censor on-the-scene news reporting. How? Well, by presenting accurate and vivid reports of the war. And what? Well, the coverage of events like the burning of Cam Ne in 1965, as we can see in the top photograph, and the Tet Offensive of 1968, as we can see in the bottom photograph, increased public opposition to the war, which they saw as both unjust and unwinnable. Make any notes that you want to on this, do your research, and when ready, we'll move on to part 3. Oh, I should add, this was increasingly critical as the war went on. For example, the news media started as broadly supportive of the war and its leaders, and as the war was more visibly going wrong, they became more critical. Now on to the next topic. Now we move on to the least pleasant topic that we'll be looking at today, and arguably in this entire series of Vietnam War videos. The My Lai Massacre. Look at the photograph first of all. It'll serve as an introduction to what we're going to be dealing with here. And I'm sorry to say that this is one of the least distressing photographs that I have related to this event. It shows Vietnamese villagers from My Lai rounded up by American servicemen who have their guns pointed towards them, and the shock and distress and upset on their faces is all too evident. Notice too that these are not combatants. There are women, children and elderly people there. Shortly after this photograph was taken, these rounded up civilians were murdered. I use that word quite deliberately. This is not a simple case of people being caught in the crossfire in a war. These people were deliberately rounded up and they were massacred by US soldiers. This is a controversial topic and one that is deeply unpleasant. I'm going to be showing another photograph in a moment which shows the effects of the My Lai massacre and does show dead bodies on a road. This again is not the most unpleasant image that I will show you, and it's certainly not the most unpleasant image out there, so be really careful when you're looking for this stuff. If you'd prefer not to look at this and you'd prefer to watch the video I've linked in the description to find out about My Lai, then please do so now. You can always skip to the end of this video or come back to this at another time when you understand a bit more. I'll leave that up to you. This image shows some of the women and children who were rounded up and massacred in My Lai. It shows one of the roads leading out of the village, and as you can see, they have simply been gunned down. So how does this link in with opposition to the war? Well, first of all, My Lai happened a couple of years before it really came to prominent public knowledge. But let's find out the background. So, who took part in the My Lai massacre? These were American soldiers of the so-called C Company, commanded by a Lieutenant Calley. Why? Well, reports and photographs of My Lai were shocking and gruesome. People questioned the behaviour of US soldiers and wondered how typical this event was of their conduct in Vietnam. How? Well, Calley was convicted but barely punished. He spent a couple of years under house arrest. All the others were not convicted. Some demanded better punishments for the other people who took part, that is. But there was little support for this, and indeed many people felt that even Calley should not have been punished for what happened. Perhaps certain people in America had become hardened to the realities of the war. Well, what? Nixon promised to review the case. 65% of American people disagreed with Calley's life sentence, and 77% felt the soldiers were only following orders. This is what I mean about Americans being hardened to the realities of the war. When did it happen? Well, the massacre itself happened in 1968, but it came to more prominent public attention in 1970 and 71 during Calley's trial. This, as we will see, was also an era of heightened opposition to the Vietnam War. Make any notes that you want to before conducting your own research, and again I do urge you to be cautious in finding information about this horrible event. You can pause the video now and press play when you're ready to continue. Okay, before we continue, I'm going to show you two other images of the My Lai massacre. I'm going to explain what they're all about, and again I do warn you that these are deeply unpleasant images. I would skip forward around 2 minutes if you do not wish to see these images. The first image shows women and children being rounded up by the soldiers. The fact of the matter is the woman in the front is buttoning up her blouse because she has just been sexually assaulted by the soldiers. Yes, that was another aspect of the My Lai massacre. The crimes done to these civilians were not just physical, they were psychological and they were often sexual in nature as well. The last image does show two dead bodies on a road and a certain amount of blood. Again, it's not the worst image that I could show you, but it's about as bad an image as I am prepared to show you on this YouTube channel. It shows a young boy and an older man dead on the road outside Camden. You can see that they have been hit by multiple machine gun bullets. It truly is an awful scene, and we must understand that these are not unique scenes in war. But My Lai was one of the more clear-cut instances of where American soldiers had committed an atrocity. These were not people who were caught in the crossfire. These are not people who had been accidentally killed. This was cold-blooded stuff. We'll move on now. I'm afraid this next case study does little to lighten the mood. The Kent State shootings of 1970. Let's have a look at the photographs first of all. In the top photograph we can see soldiers armed with weapons firing tear gas at student protesters outside one of the Kent State University campus buildings. These are not soldiers in the sense that we might be associating with the Vietnam War normally. These are National Guardsmen. These are more like part-time soldiers who are controlled by the state governor in the first instance rather than professional soldiers. We've encountered these sorts of troops before when we've looked at the Civil Rights campaign. For example, it was National Guardsmen who were initially used to bar entry to black students at Little Rock High School in 1957. In the photograph underneath, we see Mary Ann Vecchio, who was a 14-year-old girl at the time, screaming over the body of Jeffrey Miller, one of the victims of the massacre. Let's find out what happened at Kent State. In 1970, a shocking event occurred at Kent State University, Ohio. US soldiers, or rather National Guardsmen, opened fire on US citizens. Here's what happened in the days leading up to this event. On May the 1st, violence was sparked between anti-war and pro-war students at the Kent State University campus. This was sparked by Nixon's expansion of the war into Cambodia, which we've covered in other lessons. On May the 2nd, anti-war protesters burned down the Officer Training Corps building. On May the 3rd, 900 National Guard soldiers broke up demonstrations using tear gas. That's what's shown in the top photograph. And then the massacre itself happened on May the 4th. May the 4th, between 2,000 to 3,000 protesters turned up, ignoring a ban on demonstrations. The National Guard fired at these students, and in a matter of seconds, 4 were killed, 9 were wounded, and 2 of the dead were not actually part of the protest. They were almost 400 feet away from where the National Guardsmen opened fire with their rifles. Their names were Jeffrey Glenn Miller, aged 20. He's pictured in the photograph on the right. Alison B. Krause, aged 19. William Knox Schroeder, aged 19 also. And Sandra Lee Shoer, who was aged 20. Now, some pro-war movements at the time were keen to point out that these poor, unfortunate students were only 4 in number, unlike the thousands who were being killed on a weekly basis in Vietnam itself. Nevertheless, it was recognised that there was a distinction here. These were young students with their whole lives ahead of them who were killed by fellow Americans. People wanted to know what went wrong. Let's find out. Firstly, summarise the event under the headings when, where, and where did it happen, why were the students protesting, who was involved, and what happened. Secondly, most Americans blamed the students for the shooting. I shall say that again. They blamed the students for the shooting, not the National Guardsmen. Why might this have been? Consider the common thoughts towards young people at this time. Do you agree that the students were to blame? After all, it could be argued that the demonstration had been banned and therefore they were looking for trouble. But does that really reflect the American value of free speech? Fourthly, as an extension, a famous protest song was written within weeks of the shooting. Why might songs have been an effective protest method? Again, in the description to this video, I've included a link to this song. I'd love to include it within the video itself, but unfortunately copyright being what it is means that this video would probably end up being taken down. The song was written allegedly in about half an hour by musician Neil Young. He was part of the supergroup at the time called Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. They recorded the song Ohio, which covered this particular shooting. It's a great song and a fantastic anthem of the era. Give it a listen. It will actually not only be a good example of a good song, but it'll help your understanding of this particular topic. Pause this video here, complete the tasks, and when you're ready, and perhaps when you've also listened to the song, move on. Okay, let's go on. I'm going to show you next another image of Jeffrey Miller. Again, it's not a particularly nice image, but it's a black and white photograph which lessens some of the graphic quality of it, but it gives another view of what really made this such a shocking event. Here we can see Jeffrey Miller. You can see his blood draining into a drain, and by this point, he was unfortunately dead. Why I'm showing you this, though, is because it's important to realise that the mass media of the early 1970s was putting these pictures in the newspapers and on the television, and people had very easy access to these images. We think about mass communication as being quite a modern phenomenon when it comes to the internet, for example, but actually images such as this were distributed across the United States, and they would have had an impact on anti-war sentiment. We're going to have a look more at some exam skills now. So once you've finished getting all of your information together, let's have a look at some interpretations on opposition to the war. Firstly, interpretation 1. This is from The Uncensored War, written in 1986 by Daniel C. Hawlin. There was conflict and ill feeling between the media and the government over Vietnam. In 1962 and in 1963, the Kennedy administration made an effort to discredit the young Saigon press corps, which is often at odds with the generals and ambassadors running the war. In 1965, American troops were committed to what was, in effect, the first televised war. CBS enraged Lyndon Johnson by showing American Marines setting fire to the thatched huts at Cam Ne, a Vietnamese village, with Zippo lighters. I've included a link in the description to that particular news report at Cam Ne. So let's pull apart this interpretation just briefly. Notice that in the early years of the war, in 1962 and 1963, during the Kennedy administration, Americans were not directly involved in the fighting in the same way as they were a few years later. So when it says they're trying to discredit the young Saigon press corps, these are the young reporters out in Saigon itself, and by discrediting, they're trying to make them seem untrustworthy to the public. In 1965, American troops were committed to what was in effect the first televised war, refers to the widespread television coverage of the war. CBS, remember, was a prominent news broadcasting service. All right, you may want to have a look at the burning of Cam Ne in the video in the description before moving on. When you're ready, let's have a look at Interpretation 2. Interpretation 2 is from A Bright Shining Lie, written in 1988 by Neil Sheehan. He is talking about reporting in the early years of the war. In the post-war period, which means after World War II, the American press remained the most vigorous on earth, but where foreign affairs were concerned, the reporting was weighted towards the anti-communist crusade. The reporters of the period in the early 1960s were not accustomed to thinking of their military leaders and diplomats as deluded men, and the military leaders and diplomats were not accustomed to reporters who said that they were consistently wrong. We can see here that Interpretation 2 gives a slightly different view of the media's role in Vietnam. By being weighted towards the anti-communist crusade, really what it's talking about is giving anti-communist ideas and broadly supporting the government view of the world. Similarly, at the end where it says that the leaders and diplomats were not used to being referred to as deluded men, it shows that people expected leaders and diplomats to be respected by the media rather than questioned. This gives a slightly different view to Interpretation 1, where it was saying that the Saigon press corps was often at odds, or rather against or disagreed with, the generals and ambassadors running the war. As a brief task then, suggest one reason why Interpretations 1 and 2 give different views about the media's relationship with the US government. Once you've done that brief bit of preparation, and a sentence will probably be fine, we'll move on to the first question based upon these interpretations. Let's have a look at the first exam style question. How do Interpretations 1 and 2 differ? This is a 4-mark question, and you probably won't need any longer than about 5 minutes to complete it. I've included a basic writing frame which you may use, but you don't have to. However, this is how you might approach it. In Interpretation 1 it says, and give a relevant quote, and then say what that means. However, Interpretation 2 says, give a relevant quote, and then explain how that is a different view. Here are the interpretations again. Give yourself about 5 minutes to answer this question. Pause the video and move on when you're ready. Okay, let's have a look at how you might have answered that. How do Interpretations 1 and 2 differ? In Interpretation 1 it says, there was conflict and ill feeling between the media and government over Vietnam. This means that the media did not back up the government's view of the war. However, Interpretation 2 says, where foreign affairs were concerned, the reporting was weighted towards the anti-communist crusade. This is a different view because it suggests that the media followed the government's anti-communist ideas. Take a moment to make any necessary improvements to your answer. Press pause, make the improvements, and then when you're ready, press play and we'll move on to the next section. Done? Okay, let's have a look at the second part of this. Explain why Interpretations 1 and 2 differ. 4 marks. You will need to spend a little bit longer on this, but probably not more than about 6 or 7 minutes to do it. The first and most common mistake that you can make with this particular question is by treating the interpretations like sources. That is the wrong thing to do. We are not here to decide whether Daniel C. Horlin is talking rubbish or whether Neil Sheehan is lying to us. That is not the idea. We shouldn't refer to these interpretations as necessarily biased. We shouldn't be referring to when they were written, because if you look, that's pretty irrelevant anyway. They were both written pretty close together. And we must recognise that these are history books. If history books were somehow inherently unreliable and useless, nobody would punish them. So don't go down that route. Instead, be looking at what these interpretations are focusing on. What era of the Vietnam War are they focusing on? What aspect of media coverage are they focusing on? And concentrate on why that might give different views as to the media's role in the Vietnam War. I've included another writing frame which you may use if you find it helpful, but don't feel you have to. In interpretation 1, it gives the view that, and then sum up that view. This is because, and then sum up why it has that view based on what it is focused on or its content. However, interpretation 2 is different because, again, sum up that particular interpretation's view. The reason it is different to interpretation 1 is, and then explain using quotes or examples from the interpretations, particularly related to what they are focused on. Spend about 6 minutes on this particular question. Press pause now, and then press play when you're ready to continue. Alright, this is more challenging, even though it's only worth 4 marks, so let's have a look at how you might answer it. Explain why interpretations 1 and 2 differ. 4 marks. In interpretation 1, it gives the view that the media and the government did not agree. This is because of how the war was progressing in Vietnam and the controversial actions of American soldiers such as Rolling Thunder and at Cam Ne. I've included some old knowledge here just to illustrate that. However, interpretation 2 is different because it suggests that the media backed the government. The reason it is different to interpretation 1 is because it is focused on an earlier period, the early 1960s, before the war escalated from 1965 onwards. Reporters did not have the same shocking events to report on. At that point, you would move on to part C, which is a 16-mark essay question, which is basically asking you which interpretation you agree with. Although I'm not going to ask you to complete that question today, it would be worth considering that. Think about the interpretations. Which one do you more agree with? When you've made your mind up, we'll move on to the final task. In summary, let's sum up some of our learning about the opposition to the Vietnam War now. Complete these sentences. People opposed the war because. A specific example of opposition was. Opposition to the war was or was not more significant than support for the war because. If you're unable to answer that last part, then please check out my video on support for the Vietnam War and then have a go at it again. That's the end of this particular online lesson. Thanks for taking part. I hope you found it useful, and if you did, please like this video and consider subscribing to my channel. Thanks very much, and goodbye.